That's the president of the Ontario Federation of Labour, Sid Ryan. He was on this program talking to me yesterday. He was complaining about a private member's bill that aims to make unions more accountable, according to the MP who first proposed it. Ryan and other critics say the union transparency bill is simply an attempt to bust unions. Last night we carried part of the live vote in the House of Commons, and that private member's bill indeed passed 147 to 135. The key here is 5 Tories voted against it. Here are some of the bill's highlights. Labour unions will have to provide annual reports to the Canada Revenue Agency on how they spend the dues they collect. The CRA will publish those financial reports on its website. The reports will cover all transactions greater than $5 grand. And the bill was amended last night to remove some pension provisions and make it less expensive for the government to administer this. So is this so-called union transparency bill really designed to break unions? Is it even constitutional? Will the proposed law just bog unions and governments down in red tape, or is it needed? Joining me now, the MP behind the bill, BC Conservative MP Russ Hiebert. Mr. Hiebert, good to have you on the show.
Good to be here.
Rare to see that private member's bill like this happen. Unions, a lot of them that we spoke with, are not happy, and they say not only this is unnecessary, they say it specifically targets them because under the Labour Code, Clause 110, any union member already has the right to access their union's financial information. So clearly, they say, this is unnecessary, and it shows that it's a union-busting move, not about transparency. How do you respond to that?
Well, I respond, Evan, by saying that the public forgoes about $500 million a year in tax benefits in support of labour institutions like the ones that you're referring to. And I think for that investment of $500 million, we have a right to know how this money is being spent. We do the same thing for charities. Charities have had to disclose for 35 years. Their information is put on the CRA website. And so the amendments that I brought in last night simply extend the income tax treatment of charities to a new institution called labour organizations.
I quote the MP, the Conservative MP from Edmonton St. Albert, Brent Rathgaber, who's also a labour lawyer, who voted against your bill, and he's a Conservative, and he talks about this distinction between unions and charities, and I'll quote him. I cannot accept the premise that tax-deducted union dues is somehow akin to public dollars, and therefore creating a public interest. Basically, they're different. You can't make that analogy according to a member of your own caucus.
Well, we can disagree. I mean, I think when we give preferential tax treatment to charities to encourage Canadians to donate, then, and as a result of that preferential tax treatment, Canadians have a right to know how this money is being spent. So charities have to disclose on an annual basis. The same principle applies to labour organizations or, frankly, other institutions that receive substantial public benefit.
But
if we give tax preferences,
private clubs don't. And some say the unions are essentially like private clubs. So you're going after unions in this bill, but not, let's say, the Law Society, which would be different. Why not treat it like the Law Society?
Well, in a piece of legislation, you can only capture one thing. And if somebody wanted to bring forward a piece of legislation that would capture law societies, and we can talk about that, I'm fine with that, because the principle applies. Where substantial public benefit is provided, there's a corresponding obligation for accountability and transparency. We do it in Crown corporations. We're extending it to native reserves, elected officials, government, charities. Why not labour institutions as well? And keep in mind,
but are you doing it to unions because it's a target of unions, not, as I say, doctors groups or lawyers groups? That it's not insignificant that the finger is pointing at unions who say we've already got enough transparency within our organization.
Not to taxpayers, they don't. There's no disclosure to taxpayers right now.
Why should they be disclosed to taxpayers just because these are tax-deducted union dues?
Because the taxpayer gives up $500 million a year in support of these institutions. Nobody's doubting that they're valuable institutions. I've said that all along. But when the taxpayer, you and I, support institutions like charities or labor organizations or other institutions, I believe there's a corresponding obligation for accountability and transparency, because it's our tax dollars that are being used to support them. Now let's talk about the associations.
But small businesses get tax deductions for certain. There's all sorts of tax deductions. There's all sorts of benefits that you get sending your kids to a sports group. I mean, the government gets all sorts of tax breaks. These are union members who are paying their own union dues, their own money to do it. So
well, they're actually being forced to pay those dues. They're not voluntary like it is with charities.
But that's a different thing. But they're doing it. They're taking it. And again, is it an infringement? And by the way, some unions will say not only is it a target? They're saying we will challenge this in court. It's unconstitutional to force them to disclose because they're paying with their own money.
Okay. I'm happy to talk about that. Give me a minute.
Right.
So other G8 nations already disclose to the public where these unions spend their money. Australia, United Kingdom, France, Germany, and the United States has required disclosure since 1959. And you know what's interesting? Is that Canadian unions have had to disclose to the U.S. Department of Labor website, our department, since 1959, and it's on their website. You can look up, Evan, the United Steelworkers of Canada, and you can see the employees' salaries, how much time they spend on politics, how much time they spend on lobbying, on organizing. You can see the transactions over $5,000, all the same information that my bill asks for. These are Canadian unions that are disclosing this information. Now, when it comes to constitutionality, my private member's bill would have never made it to the House of Commons floor had it not first passed the Subcommittee for Procedure in House Affairs. They have 4 criteria. One of them is that it not offend the Constitution. And there are constitutional experts on this subcommittee. Second of all, the government supported my bill. That means the Justice Department certified it charter compliant. And that was confirmed last night when the Attorney General of Canada stood up and voted for it.
It will probably still likely get into the courts, as you and I both know.
I have no doubt.
And we'll see what the courts say about it. And as you say, it may withstand it, it may not. Yeah. What is the need? I mean, this is it comes down to your view. Is it in the public interest? And the unions. I'll just read this to people and just hear. This is what Clause 110 says, because this is where a lot of the debate goes. Every trade union and every employer's organization shall forthwith, on the request of any of its members, provide the member free of charge with a copy of a financial statement of its affairs to the end of the last fiscal year, certified to be a true copy of its president and treasurer, by its president and treasurer, or by its president and any other officer responsible for handling the administration. So if I'm a union member and I have problems with what they're spending money on, I already can find out totally transparently what the union's doing. Why does the government need to know if the union members who are paying its dues have already the right to know?
It's not about the government. It's about the public. Why does the public need to know? Because they're paying $500 million a year to support these institutions. That's a pretty hefty price tag for transparency, but it's there. In terms of members, you know, I've heard from a lot of members in the last year and a half who tell me they are fearful of asking for this information. They are blackballed. You know, if anybody makes those requests,
Can you name a union that supports this?
I've heard privately from labor organizations.
No public.
They're also fearful. I mean, those are the tactics that labor organizations use. They use fear. But this is about the taxpayer.
He said, she said, if you have a union that supports you, we'd love to hear it.
Fair enough. But this is about the taxpayers. This is about Canadians who support these institutions like they support charities. Charities have to disclose because we support them with our tax dollars. Unions have to disclose because we support them with our tax dollars. Other countries do it. Canadian unions do it in the United States. What's the problem with leveling the playing field?
All right. Russ Hiebert, you got the vote last night, and obviously there's more discussion to come, but great to have you, and thanks for coming on to talk about it.
My pleasure.
Coming up after the break, the power panels here. They weigh in on the dilemma over how to deal with mentally ill people who commit violent crimes. We've talked about this Guy Turcotte case. This is a tough case, James. Moore was on earlier. Tom Flanagan, Jerry Kaplan, Lisa Frula, John Iveson will weigh in. What could the feds do anyway in a case like this? Find out